Real quick, I'm going to show you our newest members of the farm. It is day 42 of training for a marathon for trans equity. I am going to be super honest with you. I have not been running for the past week. It's been about a week since I last ran, for a variety of reasons that I won't get into. And instead of feeling really badly about it and like I had dropped the ball and let everyone down and let myself down and everything else, I've decided to just kind of move past the pity party and get back to work. So here we are. Today's going to be a short run to get back into it. So today is June 15th, 2020. And it's an exciting day because the Supreme Court of the United States decided a very important case that decided once and for all that LGBTQ people are protected against discrimination by employers. This is a really big deal. About half the states in the United States don't have statewide protections like New York does. And so if you were LGBTQ or even thought to be LGBTQ and lived in one of those states that didn't have its own protections, you could be fired from your job or harassed at work or demoted or passed up for promotion or all sorts of terrible things and have no legal recourse. Now you do. This is something that advocates have been fighting for a really long time. And given the state of the country, given the state of this administration, even given the makeup of the Supreme Court, we were worried. But now we know. So when I saw the decision this morning, I actually cried quite a bit. It's a big deal for the highest court in the country to acknowledge and recognize and protect LGBTQ people. I cried thinking about all the people who have experienced discrimination in the workplace. And for those who haven't, hard to explain the heartbreak and the shame and the guilt and the rage that comes when it happens. Because here you are, just being you, and someone says, you don't have a right to make a living. You don't have value here to us. Your value is determined by our preset notions of who and what we think you should be. For somebody who has been doing this work for quite some time now, but certainly not as long as others, I cried because we're actually getting somewhere, and it feels good to know that all that hard work is actually paying off in real tangible ways. And I found myself crying because of what and who was considered expendable along the way. And all of these legal cases that have come over the last several decades to get us to this place, the vast majority, if not all of them, involved white, gender binary plaintiffs. And by that I mean people who identified as trans men, people who identified as trans women, and are white. So not really much in way of non-binary identities or gender-expansive identities. And really nothing in the way of folks of color. As far as I know, the vast majority, if not the only federal cases involving trans people of color have to do with incarceration. Whether it's cruel and unusual punishment to to house trans people in a facility that is not aligned with their gender identity, and to deny trans people access to medically necessary care while they're incarcerated. There are a good handful of these cases, and most of them are trans women of color who, as Black trans women, are experiencing all sorts of intersecting forms of discrimination, which really influence and inform the fact that they're incarcerated to begin with. We have to ask ourselves why. These cases are brought by the major organizations, the big nonprofit impact litigation firms, representing a pretty narrow group of folks. I think it's important to name that and to hold the organizations accountable for it. And if pressed, what they might say is, well, if we're dealing with a federal court and if we're dealing with a potential jury trial, we want plaintiffs who juries will feel most sympathetic for. And so we need plaintiffs that they will understand, plaintiffs that they can relate to, plaintiffs that they could say, oh, this could be my sister or brother, my niece or nephew, my son or daughter. That it's a strategy to select sort of gender normative, gender conforming white trans people. Well, that's one response to that. We have to ask ourselves, what is this doing to perpetuate the narrative that white trans people are having trouble accessing equitable employment, healthcare, and education opportunities, and Black trans women specifically are incarcerated? And that's the narrative, right? If you don't bring any cases that involve Black trans women being discriminated by an employer, then we don't associate Black trans women with being employed. If you don't bring any cases of Black non-binary people with disabilities being discriminated against by an educational institution or a healthcare institution, then we don't associate Black non-binary disabled people as needing healthcare or achieving higher education or any kind of education. These cases, although their ultimate outcomes can be beneficial, are not reflective of our communities and are therefore perpetuating in the minds of the courts and the minds of the judges and in the minds of the juries who we will eventually see in the future that these are the plaintiffs that they should sympathize with. These are the plaintiffs they should expect to see. It's also doing a disservice for the community because we're not putting forward arguments that are challenging the intersections of discrimination. Because the truth is, the discrimination a white trans person experiences in a workplace is fundamentally different and categorically different from the discrimination a Black trans woman faces in the workplace, right? A Black trans woman is going to be experiencing racism, sexism, transphobia, probably homophobia, as well as ableism and classism, all at the same time. And so the epithets and slurs, the harassment, the chronic misgendering, the refusal by employers to believe them when they say they're being harmed, the relocating to shitty job tasks, and the unlawful termination are so based on the intertwining aspects of gender nonconformity and racism and sexism and probably ableism too. And if we're not representing those plaintiffs in cases large and small, if attorneys aren't taking these cases to the state and federal agencies, like in New York we have the Division of Human Rights, of course there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or state court, or now federal court, if we're not bringing those cases, then we're not getting to make those really important and really critical and creative arguments about the nuances of intersecting forms of oppression. And what it means is that when a black trans woman who's experienced discrimination in her place of work tries to find an attorney in her local area, maybe in Ohio, maybe in Texas or Virginia or Mississippi or New Mexico, right? And she tries to explain what it is that's happened to her. And that attorney looks at the case law and says, gosh, nobody's ever really brought a case that talks about people experiencing discrimination because of their race and their gender identity and expression. I don't know if I know how to do that. You know what, I really can't help you with this case. It's outside of my wheelhouse. It's outside of my area of expertise. If a white trans person goes to that same attorney, the attorney can look at the tome of opinions that have come down that the big nonprofit organizations have all brought at this point and say, sure, I see you reflected in these cases. This is pretty straightforward. This is a classic case of gender identity discrimination and therefore sex discrimination. I got this. I could do this for you. What this means is that white trans people are going to disproportionately benefit across the board from this decision. And so this is a moment to celebrate, and this is a moment to pause and say, what did we do to get to this place? Who did we leave behind? Who still needs help? And how can we do it better next time? Because repeating the same sort of strategy, going through the same cycle, is just going to perpetuate this. We're just going to keep leaving people behind until it's convenient to pick them up and bring them along. Well, that's intolerable. So if you live in a state that does not have statewide protections for LGBTQ people, and you now have a community of residents who just won some pretty badass federal rights, there is more work to do, and that is to get everybody educated about what those rights are, how to exercise those rights, and to get attorneys, the bar associations, and the court systems in your state up to speed on what it means to see these cases, to take these cases to represent these folks, and also to push for your legal system to start to understand and appreciate intersecting forms of oppression and how they play out in people's lives and in their legal cases. So what can you do in your local community? What can you do to start that next phase of the work, to make sure that your community has the resources it needs to exercise its rights? And what can we do to get all of the supporting systems that are in place that are supposed to provide access to justice for everybody equally? What can we do to make sure that it's actually equitable? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. And to everyone, let's celebrate today and then get back to work. And as always, don't forget to stretch.